Whilst we're on the topic of the UFC, it's time to do my fighter of the month for March. March showed a slowing of the UFC's sort of role in terms of card after card after card. They are slightly slowing down in terms of the number of cards they are producing. Something that a lot of us have been complaining about for at least 4 or 5 years now is that the UFC have a little bit of an issue with their expansion mechanism, and that is that they are watering down the market by producing too many cards in too quick a succession. The problem with that is that a lot of the mixed martial arts world is online, and in order to be able to sort of drum up support for both sides, you need more than about 3 or 4 days of discussion on forums and stuff like that. And what was happening was we were being introduced to a lot of fighters that were subpar in terms of UFC performances before that date. This is of course because they suddenly expanded their roster to be able to sort of allow everybody to compete more. The problem was also that they were charging the same amount, at least in the US, for these cards, and they were substandard. They were becoming substandard, but they were asking the same price, and a lot of people would miss out entire cards, almost turning their numbered events and their sort of fight nights into 2 different leagues. You know, let's only watch the numbered events because they are, you know, fantastic and they are stacked cards, whereas the fight night events, well, they're not so good really. They're full of old people who have done not so well and new people who we don't know. And of course you can't get to know these fighters very well because there is still too big a roster, I suppose, in terms of how often they compete. Now if that was the only issue that was problematic with the UFC and their sort of expansion mechanism, then it wouldn't be too bad. However, the UFC also at the same time decided that they had to start an expansion in terms of physically placing cards in different parts of the world. And the issue with that was that they weren't then producing enough cards to sustain industries in each of those places. So, for example, you know, they used to visit England maybe 3 or 4 times a year. You know, they would have a card maybe once a quarter in England, back in times when they only did cards in the US, mainly in Nevada and a couple of other states, and maybe Canada. And what they did there was, because they came to the UK reasonably often, they built up a industry that survived. And of course their first big sort of flashes in terms of trying to captivate the market with sort of foreign people from the American perspective was employing quite a lot of British fighters. Now when they started to expand rapidly, they put cards in different places. You know, you're talking like the Middle East, the Far East, Australia, other places in Europe. And because they weren't producing enough cards to sustain the markets that they already had outside of the US, they started to fall behind. It became then only 2 cards in England per year. So that's halved the number of the cards that are here, and halved therefore the support from that growing sort of contingent. And then they'd have, say, 1 card in Germany, 1 card a year is not enough to sustain a proper market where, you know, you think that, well, the reason these cards are now selling out has nothing to do with the fact that the UFC is like, having a good market in those countries. It's because the market it can't sustain cannot fit into 1 card. So it's a false perception. You think, oh my God, the UFC are so loved in Germany that they sell out in 2 minutes. And what I'm saying is, no, the problem is that the entire German nation, which is interested in mixed martial arts, is trying to cram itself into 1 single event because the UFC only go there once a year. So it's bizarre, because in one way they were doing too many cards and destroying the online communities in the process, and in another way they weren't doing enough cards to sustain markets outside of themselves. And the issue with that was they were going to too many places too quickly. The growth in the UK took a long time. It took a long time for them to sort of work up to that number of events in this country. You know, they would maybe do 2 in London, 1 in Liverpool, and then 1 in, Ireland. And that so that takes a long time. Their expansion was too quick, I think, and they are beginning to learn that, and they are compensating for that. It's taken them a long time to hear what we've said about that. They really should have sorted that out earlier. I think their issue was, as a private capitalistic company, all they were doing was wanting to sort of make money. They are also noting that whilst it is okay to employ fighters that are good in a particular nation to try and start a proper community, their issue there is that their rosters don't work. Say you had, I don't know, 6 Britons, and the idea is that those Britons are sort of the face of Britain, and they're designed to continue to fight and work their way up. What happens then when you need 10 Italians or 10 Chinese, for example? Now the issue is that with the Chinese, that is specific to its market until they become sort of legendary, if you know what I mean. So what do? Do you sacrifice the 6 Britons and say, sorry, 3 of you have failed, we want to get rid of you, so that we can employ 10 Chinese, which is good for China and good for that growing market there, but not so good for the rest of the world. And then when you cannot support the Chinese market enough to make it grow, you're then left with these 10 Chinese fighters who have fought maybe once or twice, aren't amounting to a huge thing in their country, will never amount to a huge thing internationally. And what do you do? Because you've then lost your British fighters who you were working your way up. And of course, they've changed their minds in that respect as well. There's been a lot less shifting in the last, 7 or 8 months. And part of that is that they're going back to a strategy that worked very well for them before. And that was to get one person from a particular industry, a particular market, use that person to build that market, but also push him internationally to try and bring in other markets. It's successful for the Western world. It is successful for the Western world. They can do that in Europe, they can do that in Canada, they can do that in America, they can do that in England. And as they've been doing for a long time, they've done that with Latin America, and there's a crossover there. I'm not so sure people like Conor McGregor will have any particular growth potential, even on an international level, for the Far East. It's balancing 2 worlds, so they are beginning to listen to us, and as a consequence, there was only 2 events last month. One of which was absolutely historical. I mean, it was legendary. This was McGregor versus Diaz. And it's interesting because there was absolutely nothing in this fight for Nathan Diaz at all. If Nathan Diaz wins this fight, what does he win? Absolutely nothing. It's a welterweight match, and he doesn't win anything. There's no automatic bid for a title. There's no automatic bid for contendership. There's nothing. He is just merely a person in a different category who can speak smack, so he will generate money and is willing, for no particular reason at all, to fight Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor, of course, is completely different. He stands to win the world here, because if he wins the match, then he is automatically entitled to go on and challenge the champion of that division. So this is all about pushing Conor McGregor still. And in fact, this match, in a way, should never have happened, because this was the match that should have been Conor McGregor immediately fighting for a different title in a different weight class versus Rafael dos Anjos. And that would have been a significant event, because never has somebody been promoted and pushed in that manner since BJ Penn, and that was a very long time ago. So, and one could say there was a lot more. There was a lot more skill, and there was a lot more history, and a lot more sort of. How do you put this, qualification, I suppose, for the two people that were involved there, when you've got George St Pierre and BJ Penn, both with historic legacies at that time, rather than Rafael dos Anjos, who is a relatively new champion, and Conor McGregor, who, I mean, you know, he's been rushed to the top, arguably got lucky, I don't know, and now instantaneously is sort of, you know, upping and leaving his division. And we've already seen that doesn't work, because now we have a card coming up later, which I'll talk about significantly towards the time that it happens. But we have a card now where he is fighting a rematch of this same event. Again, one presumes at the same level, at the same weight, and one assumes again there is nothing in it particularly for Nathan Diaz, except that he might be able to win again, and maybe in the same way. I suppose he does stand to finish now McGregor's legacy, rather than just overturn the bandwagon, which he did, and which is why I'm giving him my Fighter of the Card award for UFC 196. But it does mean that whilst McGregor is now involved in endless fights, if he wins this one, they'll then have to do a best of three. He is still the champion of his own division, and there are people there waiting to challenge who are waiting now indefinitely. So the UFC has sort of listened to the fact that we say that that's unfair as well, and said, well, okay, let's do an interim championship. Let's put that on the same card. So now we have the champion fighting a bout at a different weight class that doesn't actually make sense in terms of the UFC and its structure, on the same card as two contenders for his belt fighting each other for an interim title, which is plucked out of the air because, for no apparent reason really, other than to create a belt to make them think that they're progressing when they're not. It's bizarre. You know, you only ever create an interim belt, which I don't like anyway, when you either, you know, the champion is, you know, out of action for a long time and it's not worth stripping him at that point, or he is stripped, I suppose, in one way or another, and you have to sort of get a belt pretty quickly. It doesn't make sense. So the whole thing is a bit of a mess. The whole thing needs to be sort of sat down and thought about, really. But in a way, they are listening and they are changing. But in another way, they are now coming up against some of the problems that we predicted they would have for a long time. The other match was Fight Night 85, and this was a not so interesting card, except for the two main events. Well, the top event was Mark Hunt and Frank Mir, and Mark Hunt managed to knock out Frank Mir. I don't think that's been done before. It was pretty like, oh my god. However, Frank Mir is old and doesn't always turn up, if you know what I mean. I was more interested in the other bout, which was at the top of the card, and that was Neil Magny versus Hector Lombard. Hector Lombard should have won that one, and he was destroyed within seconds of it starting. And I think that was the bout. I really ought to sort of rewatch these things closer to the time I do these videos, but I think that was the bout where you could even have argued that stoppage was late. But I thought that was pretty dramatic, dramatic enough to award Neil Magny the fighter of the card for that event. And I shall be back next month with my fighters of the card for this month, and any other interesting topics I think need to be talked about concerning the UFC and MMA.